Virginia Cox. I'm academic director here and co-organizer of these Acton lectures. So when the book that this event is centred around first came to the attention of me and my co-organiser, Bruce Edelstein, who's here, we decided that we would invite the author, Axel Körner, over to give a talk about the book. It seemed very perfect for this series because apart from the intrinsic interest of the subject matter, you know, it's just exactly right for the context of these lectures in an American university base in Italy, and also in this villa whose very rich history incorporates both Italian and American strands, as well as British, of course, as well. So we were originally envisaging something much more like a kind of straight talk, a kind of book launch style talk. But Professor Körner suggested the format of a discussion, and working with him and his very helpful suggestions, we were delighted to be able to put together such a distinguished panel of historians to talk about this important new book. So the format we've decided on is that the two discussants will first give a short response to the book, and then the author will respond to their responses. And then I'm just hoping that things will proceed in a rather free-flowing way from that point, and that our three panelists will continue to discuss the book and points arising from their initial presentations, and that then we'll be able to throw the discussion open to the audience. And maybe the initial discussion will be in English, but the Q&A, I think, could be bilingual in Italian and English. So I'm going to keep my introductions very minimalist because we have three speakers to introduce, and I don't want to cut into the event time. Also, our speakers are very distinguished, as I said. So starting with the author, who's sitting in the middle, Axel Körner is Professor of Modern History at University College London and Director of the UCL Centre for Transnational History. His main fields of specialism are 19th century cultural and intellectual history and the history of opera. And his most recent monographs are Politics of Culture in Liberal Italy, From Unification to Fascism, which came out with Routledge in 2009, and the book that we are here to discuss today, which, since you have the title here on your seats, I won't read. This book came out just last year with Princeton University Press. So moving on to our discussants in alphabetical order, Lucy Riall is Professor of History of Europe in the World, 19th to 20th centuries, at the European University Institute, where Professor Körner also did his PhD, so we have quite a strong EUI component in this discussion. Professor Riall works on 19th century European history with a strong focus on Italy and on the Risorgimento. And among her many books are Garibaldi, Invention of a Hero, which came out with Yale University Press in 2008, Risorgimento, The History of Italy from Napoleon to Nation State, which came out with Palgrave Macmillan in 2009, and Under the Volcano, Revolution in a Sicilian Town, which came out with Oxford University Press in 2013. That's on the popular revolt in Bronte in 1860. Our other discussant, Edoardo Tortarolo, is Professor of Early Modern History at the Università degli Studi del Piemonte Orientale in Turin. He works on European cultural and intellectual history, especially, though not exclusively, in the Enlightenment period. Like Professor Riall, his interests are very wide-ranging. Among his many publications are the monographs La ragione interpretata, la mediazione tra Italia e Germania nell'età dell'Illuminismo, which came out with Carocci in Rome in 2003, and L'invenzione della libertà di stampa, censure e scrittori nel Settecento, which came out with the same publisher in 2011, and more recently in an English language edition in 2015. So, without further ado, welcome to all our speakers, welcome to all of you for coming, and we look forward to a fascinating discussion.
Well, it's a real pleasure to be here in this extraordinary place, and thank you all for coming. And I mean, the first thing I'd like to do is to congratulate Axel for the book, which is a fascinating and important book. It's ambitious, often entertaining. It's a very good read. And also, I would say, because I've known Axel for really quite a long time now, I know just how much research and time and thought has gone into it. So, although, and this is something I'll actually return to, although it is sort of in theory, and it is about America and Italy, it's about a lot more than America and Italy. It's about a lot of, I recognise a lot of the conversations that we've had and other papers that you've given in this. So, I mean, I think it's a as I say, as I wrote this, I was going to say, you know, you've been working on it for ages, but that sounds rude. But you've been working on it for ages in a good way. I can see how much, as I say, how much time and thought has gone into it. And in particular, it to me brings together your great variety and spread of interests. I mean, in the Risorgimento, in sort of cultural history, and particularly the history of music, in the history of political thought, and also in sort of transnational history and global history. So the subject, just to kind of introduce you, and I know Axel will say a bit more about the book also, but as I understand the book, what I understood the book to be about, it's about, as the subtitle suggests, it's about how the Risorgimento imagined, or how people in the Risorgimento imagined and thought about the United States in this period, 1763 to 1865, with particular reference to politics, political ideas, and political culture, broadly defined. Most notable, or one of the most notable aspects of the book is the huge variety of sources that Axel uses. The bibliography in and of itself is worth the price of the book. It's an extraordinary, I mean, in a period when actually often authors no longer include bibliographies in their books. This is actually extraordinary rich source in and of itself, and actually, and again, very carefully annotated. So as a piece of scholarly production, I can thoroughly recommend it. But also, as I say, from the variety, which Axel looks at political treatises by people like Gaetano Filangieri, and also more popular pamphlets. He looks at broadsheets, satires, much shorter pieces, as well as novels on the one hand and opera on the other, and each chapter is devoted. It is chronological, the book, but it's not a kind of seamless narrative. Each chapter is devoted to a particular subject or a particular source, which I think is absolutely the way to deal with a subject of this kind. So there's quite a lot of what we are used to calling nowadays kind of shifting of scales, from the general to the particular, to the individual, and then back again to the general. Notable also, which I wanted to bring to your attention, is the shift in chronology. It seems to me that the book is part of a growing trend, which is to lengthen the 18th century and to shorten or shrink the 19th. So we no longer talk about the 19th century, because it's actually, in a way, it seems to me that you see a long continuum going on from 1763 all the way to 1865, and that the period after 1865 is quite another. And that actually is interesting because it's innovative, and actually it's something that perhaps you'd like to talk a little bit more about why you chose this particular 100 years, mid-18th to mid-19th. And also notable for the implicit assertion, which again if you would like to, I'd like to hear a bit more about. There's an implicit or assertion or assumption that there is such a thing as Italy in this period before unification. That there is, in fact, some kind of common culture and systems of thought that's shared by Piedmont, Tuscany, Papal States and or Sicily. That's clear in the narrative, and it's convincing, but I'd like to hear a little bit more about that choice, because both of these are choices, interesting ones as well. Axel's main argument is that and I quote, is that Italian ideas of the United States during the period of the Risorgimento cannot be reduced to blind admiration for America's political experiments. He argues, moreover, that Italians were selective in what they engaged with in the US and what they took from the US, and that this selection of what they engaged with reflected the beholder as much as the object. In other words, what Italians chose to engage with or to adopt or to admire tells you as much, if not more, about Italy than it does about the United States. And he also argues that the flow of ideas across the Atlantic was never one-dimensional, and that the flow of ideas was linked instead by a series of different connections between people and events, and often mediated through several different publications or people or events, for that matter. In particular, this is again what I've understood from the book, Axel argues that there are two main ways in which the US can be clearly said to have inspired political thought on the one hand and the cultural imagination in Italy on the other. First of all, as a metaphor for barbarism, or not just barbarism, but a particular kind of absence of civilization. So not so much, although obviously it is described as barbarism, it's a kind of an absence of something that's in Europe but isn't in the United States. And secondly, so there's a metaphor for barbarism, and secondly is a vision of the political and social future. Thus, he would, I think you conclude, that the image of the USA in Italy was double-faced, in the sense that it is both atavistic, barbarous, non-civilization on the one hand, and modern on the other. It represents a future on the other, if not necessarily a future that Italians aspire to. In fact, it's often represented, and you spend a lot of time talking about this, in the shape of slavery, of which you devote the last chapter, and more generally in a discussion of federalism as a model, a possible model for Italy. Both in discussions of slavery and federalism, the United States becomes a vision of what Italy did not want to become. So in other words, quite a lot of the discussion of the United States is actually critical rather than admiring. Insofar, moreover, as Italians did engage with US as a political model, it was often, and there's some very interesting discussion of this in the chapter of 1848, it was often, or at least as part of, a model, a more general model of republicanism and revolution, which was also associated with France. Here, too, there are reasons why Italians are suspicious of the US model as part of a bigger model which includes France, particularly in the thought of people like Mazzini, who constructed at least some of their political ideas in opposition to France. So again, it's much more problematic than one might, or the reputation of America and Italy might imagine. Moreover, and this is the final point before I actually pose a couple of questions, you also seem to argue, I think, from time to time, you go a bit further than that, and you say that actually Italians were not always that interested in the US. The idea that there was a kind of, there was a preoccupation with North America, suggested by, and there's a very interesting discussion about Tocqueville, suggests that there was a kind of preoccupation with the US. Well, you seem to suggest that actually that's not really the case. That actually Italians may even been argued to have engaged with events in the United States slightly randomly, depending on kind of what was happening at home, what were the needs of the moment. So they actually engage with what's happening in the US often for reasons of expediency rather than for reasons of a clearer kind of ideological affinity. So that in that respect it's a far-off place rather than a direct inspiration to the Risorgimento. I mean, it seems very clear from what you argue that you don't think the United States was a direct inspiration in any kind of obvious way. So in all of this, there's a challenge which you, I think, at least once, but I think more than once, you say, it's a challenge to this idea of the age of the democratic revolutions associated with people like Palmer, in that, the United States, the revolution that is started in the United States then spreads around the northern hemisphere and indeed the southern hemisphere, and that in fact kind of America sets the trend for the next 50 years of revolution. You argue very clearly against that. I think this is a really very interesting argument, and particularly rich, as I say, are the sources that you use to argue about how the kind of image of America, the image of the United States is formulated amongst Italians in this period. I have a couple of things that I think are missing, and this is more, this is not so much to say you should have done this, you should have done that, which is hopeless, because obviously one can always do more. But it was rather, again, actually to ask you about your choices. So it's to say kind of why did you choose to focus on one thing and not on another. So first of all, I wondered why you focused not exclusively, but almost exclusively on the liberals and the Democrats. There is a section when you talk about Harriet Beecher Stowe, you talk about the Catholic Church. But I would have been curious to know what conservatives made of the United States in this period, and wondered why you chose not to spend too much time on that. And the same thing, I wondered why you focused, again, why the choice to focus so much on politics and on specific cultural representations, so Verdi and Harriet Beecher Stowe, because what I've found, looking at the way in which Italians imagine, think about, describe the Americas, and I'll come to that in a moment, in this period, I've been very struck by how to what extent scientists actually engage in events in America, geographers, actually doctors, the whole gamut, if you like, of kind of professionals and technicians, the extent to which they really do engage with what's happening on the American continent, partly because it's a land of economic opportunity. And this I would argue, but we can talk about that perhaps later, but this happens long before the period of mass migrations. And I wondered why you didn't say more about this. I say this because while your argument is clear here, and I think I don't have a problem with it, your answers are anticipated by the sources that you've chosen. And so it's a little bit, I wanted to just push you a little bit on that. So I have a feeling, from my perspective, you may be looking in the wrong place for evidence of the kind of inspiration of America in Italian thought. And then I think perhaps the final point I wanted to make, and this is just to be provocative, actually, Axel, because I'm sure you expect it of me. I want to know why you wrote the book, in the sense that you spend. It's a curious book in the sense that you spend a lot of time. America and Italy, the United States, and the political thought and imagination of the Risorgimento. You spend a lot of time telling us how America was not important in Italy, and they didn't actually inspire that. So I wondered what was going on there, really. And actually, again, just to push a little bit, if the US is not important in the way that its reputation might suggest, where was the transnational inspiration in the Risorgimento? Because I think you argue that there was one. I would be surprised to hear you argue that there wasn't. And I wondered why you didn't tell us more. Actually, you do occasionally tell us more about this, and then you kind of veer off and get back to America. And again, I wonder about that choice, because it seems to me that actually, in some ways, there's another book trying to get out here, particularly in the sections on 1848. And I wondered why you kept coming back to the US. So why you made the US so central. And then, so final point about that. I wanted to draw the image Thierry Paula's image to your attention. Because it's not, surely, I mean, you tell me, but surely it's not the United States that's depicted in this.
It's America. Yeah.
It's America. And therefore, it's the Americas. And therefore, you know, actually, and then looking at it more carefully, I'm not even sure it's North America at all. I think it's probably Central America and a little bit of South America, even looking at the trees and the people that are figured there. So, you know what's coming. Where was America in this period? In the 18th century, it's not the USA. The USA doesn't exist, in fact. I mean, you know, we all know this. But Spanish, it's about Spanish America. And after 1815, it strikes me that Italians, until really quite late, are not interested in the United States because they're much more interested in Central America. They're interested in Mexico. They're interested in Venezuela. They may be interested in Haiti, right? And so I just wondered again, I mean, I'm sure this is not about why didn't you, because I'm sure there are lots of practical reasons why, but I'm just wondering again about the choice to focus explicitly on the United States, because I think if one had focused on another part of or actually on the Americas, a very different picture might have emerged.
Well,
yes, sorry, I'm done.
No, it's okay. I was waiting for the clapping.
No, it's
that didn't happen. So, well, thank you for the invitation, of course, and thank you for hosting this meeting in this extremely cosmopolitan atmosphere, which reflects the cosmopolitanism that is the core of Axel Körner's book. I would like to start exactly from the point where Lucy Riall has left her remarks, the notion of America. To somebody who grew up in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, as myself, America in Italy would make perfect sense because the presence of America has been major in everybody's culture. Not probably for the best reasons of the world, so that a book entitled American Italy would have probably, if published in the 1970s, a subtitle like The Secrets of the CIA in Post-War Italy, or just, I mean, I'm making this up, obviously, of course. I didn't check, but it is highly unlikely that this book was ever published. Or another potential subtitle would have been How Capitalism Had Enslaved Italy and Similar Subjects. So that would be perfectly okay with me. And it is interesting that times have changed, that the implications of the title are completely different, and that America in Italy is the appropriate title for a book on the perception of America as a single entity basically in the long 18th/19th century. The chronology is also interesting. I would like to add something to what Lucy Riall has already said. It is a very unconventional chronology. 1763 makes some sense for Italy, it makes sense for America, but 1865 does only make sense for the US at that time. I tried desperately to remember a crucial event in Italian history happening in 1865. I couldn't find.
It's administrative unification, actually. It's when they passed.
Yeah, okay, but
that
touches the life of many people.
Couldn't resist, you know.
And probably many people were born and died on that year, which is extremely important to them. But it's from an Italian perspective, 1870 would make obviously more sense, or 1861. Anyway, so it is definitely the American perspective that prevails. And the American perspective prevails because for the Italians in the late 18th and in the first half of the 19th century, America was a single entity. As it has been already mentioned, America was basically the whole continent. For the most people, that was Spanish America, but Spanish America reached until 1848 quite up to the north. So, and I cannot resist the temptation to quote the American ambassador in Rome, Thomas Nelson Page, who wrote about Italian misconceptions of the US during World War I. I would say that the feeling towards America is rather one of complete indifference, based for the most part on complete ignorance of what America is and represents. The great body of the people who represent Italian life make no distinction between the United States and the states of South America. They have hitherto thought of it only as perhaps the larger Brazil or Argentina or Mexico, and they have not got very far yet with this idea. So, as late as the early 20th century, the United States, as a cultural and political entity, had a very hard time to be really understood and conceptualized in a way. So one of the main topics, and a very crucial one that Axel has addressed in his book, is how it came that America imposed itself in the political cultural arena in Italy in the 19th century. And the perception which I share with Lucy about the lack of interest and the sort of fuzziness of the image of the United States that prevailed in Italy until 1865 should be viewed, in my perspective, against this slowing process of becoming of age, in a way, for the United States in the European political discussion. So America was a single entity, and from that entity, the specificity of the United States were formed along quite a long period of time, as a matter of fact. The second point is that one of the merits of the book is basically that the American perspectives contributes to assessing the quality of the political culture in Italy in the Risorgimento, which varied enormously. So this is, to me, quite implicit in what Axel Körner has written, that there was a break with the French Revolution that induced a sort of immaturity in the political perspective. So from the openness of the late Enlightenment, and the wealth of information that was available basically to the average Italian citizen and reader at the end of the 18th century, the flow of information and knowledge about America decreased dramatically after 1815, and the shock of the French Revolution created the history of the American Revolution. It is also a matter of source. What could Botta read about the American Revolution? It's not purely or Londoni or Compagnoni. They couldn't read, as far as I know, English. Sources in English were scarcely available in Italy at that time, and they had to rely on French sources. And French sources were definitely outdated. They were not up to the point, and the people who actually had the first-hand knowledge of America, like our common friend Philip Mazzei, was the Italian friend of Jefferson and lived close to Jefferson in Monticello, came back to Italy and died without sharing much of what he had learned with his countrymen in the early 19th century. So there was a sort of decrease in the quality of the information about America that reflects in the quality of the remarks that were made on the US in the 1830s and 1840s. A crucial point of Axel Körner's book is an analysis of the political debates in 1848 in three crucial places of revolution and upheaval and political discussion: Milano, the Tuscan discussion in general, and Sicily. And we see that people are obviously interested in theory in what is going on the other side of the Atlantic, but at the same time the wealth and the quality of information about more familiar political situations like Switzerland or the Dutch Republic or France, obviously, prevails on the quality of information on the US. And to put it in a nutshell, in my remarks, I couldn't resist the temptation to write the following sort of ironic phrase: there was no French Tocqueville in Italy at that time. As a matter of fact, those who went to the United States did not explicit their opinions and remarks on the constitutional arrangements that were made there. And in general, after Castiglioni, Mazzei, probably Da Ponte, not that much was written on that from first-hand knowledge. Those who were really interested in that, for instance, Cattaneo, who obviously was attracted by the American paradigm because of federalism, could not really make a clear distinction between what Italians could learn from American federalism and what they could learn probably much more from the Swiss model. So there was really a sort of disproportion in the influence of these different examples that were available. There were, however, different sources that could be of some use to Italians, and they probably were used or sort of are present in those interventions. But most of them are anti-American. One example for me is Volney, the French revolutionary who visited America in 1795, and he had meetings with Jefferson, and he was first-hand witness of slavery and among the very first of the mistreatment of the natives. And he wrote about his experience, published that as Tableau du climat et du sol des États-Unis, 1803. And a man, sort of second-rank thinker and political motivator of the Risorgimento, a Tuscan called Marmocchi, published the translation of his travels in a work called Raccolta di viaggi dalla scoperta del nuovo continente fino ai nostri giorni, ai dì nostri, 1845. And from that very popular and very simple, very banal evidence, Italian readers could have a very negative impression of America, especially as a land where slavery was rampant. It is one of the merits of the book that the question of slavery is addressed very directly, and Italian reactions were varied, obviously. I didn't know anything about the ballet Bianchi e Neri, or Neri e Bianchi, whatever it was. And it opened up a very wide horizon on the creation of political culture. It is not only sophisticated political thought, it is in many cases, as with us in our modern world, a variety of sources, including opera, including ballet, including newspaper reports. This brings me to I also have two questions. I think you had three, I leave myself to two, that are of methodological nature, and I think they are implicit in Axel's book, and they are worth further discussion, obviously, if he wants to pick them up. The first one is about context, intellectual context, political context. It is a book about the way in which a political context is created a long time. And political context is a very necessary notion for historians. I mean, without context, it is really difficult to operate. At the same time, it is a very touchy and difficult topic, and I would like to hear more about that, your take on intellectual context. The second one has been is a point that Lucy has raised. It is about globality and transnational exchanges, globality, global history. These are very current categories nowadays. There is an inflation of these categories. They are sort of passepartout that should be better specified. This book is also the consequence of a sort of reflection on the notion of globality. And I would like to hear more from Axel about his notion of globality, on the historicity of globality, and to what extent globality is not a permanent entity. It is something that changes all the time. And the globality that was active in the Risorgimento, in the political thought of the men of the Risorgimento, could not be the same globality as we now have. And from that point of view, this is also a history of perception of historical categories that is definitely thought-provoking and challenging in a way. It is the first step in a revision and a reassessment of the Italian Risorgimento from a transnational point of view, no doubt about that. But I would like to hear more about what you mean by transnational and global. Thank you very much.
Let me start by thanking Professor Cox and the Villa La Pietra for the invitation and for giving so much attention to this book I published last year. And it's wonderful to be back at NYU, where I some time ago had a fellowship where actually I started writing bits of the book and had the chance to discuss it with Tony Judd. That was a wonderful beginning to this project, but it's also very special for me to be back in Florence, where in the early 1990s I did my PhD at the EUI. And so it's for me particularly nice to see that you actually noticed this book and think that it's worth a discussion. And I'm, of course, incredibly grateful for these two very perceptive readers. Both of them, it's actually good. The book came out last summer, and both of you remind me actually what the book is about, and that's very useful. So I enjoyed that a lot. And I think I can say that both of you gave an image of the book, despite critical questions and also provocations, with which I can identify quite well. And that means that both of them have done their homework, and I'm very grateful for that. We all speak about books, but in the end we read so few books, so it's wonderful to see that the book is actually read and understood. What I thought I would do is that I say, hopefully briefly, what I think the book is about, and I have one point there about the outcomes, what I wanted to achieve with this book in a kind of historiographical perspective, and then maybe 1 or 2 points about methodology, which maybe reply already to some of the questions raised, and then I will maybe unpack some of the issues that Lucy and Edoardo have brought up. So in a way, that was one of Lucy's thoughts already. I wrote a book about something that isn't. So it is an important part of the argument that in the end, the United States are not all that important in these Italian debates from the 18th to the 19th century, and it might seem strange to write a book about that. But the reason why I felt very strongly that I had to write a book about it, because we all assume that the United States are so incredibly important for political modernization processes in 19th century Europe. And of course they are, but they are in a particular way. And this is what I wanted to present with it. And for me, this is very much a book about an asymmetric relationship. We think, or we tend to think about Italy as something that comes into being and that is weak and that has to learn from more advanced political systems. That's the way how we tend to think. And a lot of American thinking about Italy is still informed by that they think that Italy looks at an American experience from a perspective of inferiority. I turned that the other way around, because when I went through my sources, I noticed that Italians have a lot of good reasons to argue about this political experiment across the Atlantic from a position of confidence. It is the country which has taught Roman law since the year 1200 or something like this. They have 800 years of teaching Roman law at the University of Bologna. There's not a necessity for them to learn about the rule of law by looking at Britain or the United States, for instance. It is a country which is aware of the problematic nature of its own republican experiences, but they know how republicanism works. European and transatlantic republicanism simply doesn't work without the knowledge, this baggage of republican theory that traveled from Italy to Britain and then to the United States. And that's something that Italians are very much aware of. It's what Pocock called famously the Machiavellian moment. So there is a Machiavellian knowledge which actually makes what happens in the United States only possible. And Italians are aware of this connection when they discover that something is going on in America in the 1780s. And so they argue about these experiments there from a position of confidence. It is important, but it's not this idea that we still have in the age of democratic revolutions and all these books, this huge corpus of historiography that thinks, in a way you can argue also about Age of Revolutions, Hobsbawm and so on, that it is always this idea that there are inferior countries which have to learn from politically more advanced countries. And this is the relationship that I try to turn upside down. So that's one very important motive for me. And when I started getting interested in this topic, I was really impressed by the fact, or by the way in which American historians, a lot of American historians, but also other continental historians, have been speaking about America's palingenetic role, an idea or explaining the Italian Risorgimento, where Garibaldi and Cavour started to reenact the roles of Washington and Franklin. Of course, this is historiography of the 1930s, and we don't really think like this anymore, that we're not anymore convinced that Cavour and Garibaldi only reenacted what was happening somewhere in the United States. But an idea of that, an element of that, we still have in this historiography that is informed by the argument of the age of democratic revolutions and so on. So I think there remains a very strong element of that, and this is something that I wanted to challenge by looking at a more complicated way in which Italians discussed what they knew about the political experiments in the United States. I don't actually think that I argue that the United States were not at all important. What I say is that they looked at the political experiments, at the American Revolution and the political institutions that grew out of it with a great deal of interest, but from a distance. And what they learned, what was going on there, they put into a relationship with other European experiments. Edoardo has mentioned how crucially important Swiss political experiments, of course, and constitutional debates were, where Italian scholars, Italian legal scholars and so on played also always a very important role. But it was, of course, also always a way to negotiate their own experience of the French Revolution. And if we ask about to what extent this is a transnational story that I'm telling there and not only a cross-Atlantic story, it is because looking at the American Revolution is a way of coming to terms with Napoleonic Europe and the Republican Triennial, and comparing and looking for advantages and disadvantages of different models. And Italy saw itself in the center of political change that they had to come to terms with, a very difficult experience. It's a way, looking at the United States was a way of coming to terms with their own experience of a dramatic change in the semantic of historical time. What is going on with that, with us? Why is Italy and Europe changing so fast? How can we come to terms with that? What other experiments are there that we can compare our experience to? They compare with France, and they have a lot of profound knowledge of French political constitutional debates and so on, and they look what else is there. And that is very often the position that American debates assume then in this context. So for me, addressing a historiographical agenda where we assume that there are inferior countries or peripheral countries which have to learn from political centers, be it Italy learning from France or be it Italy learning from America. So this is something that I wanted to turn upside down. And this led to a number of methodological issues that I tried to address in this book. One is a profound conviction that I developed already in some of the previous books I was writing, that Italianists cannot possibly fully understand Italy. In order to understand Italy, you should not be an Italianist. You need to know much more, because everything that is interesting about Italy in that period is what they learn in a constant process of exchanges with lots of other cultural and political experiences. We can't distinguish the experience of American democracy from the experience of French democracy with which they engaged. And also regarding now questions of what Italy I speak about, a lot of the book deals with northern Italy, with the provinces of the Habsburg Empire. These scholars who got interested in the American Constitution and in political institutions, they knew extremely well a tradition of rule of law going back to Maria Theresia in the Habsburg provinces. They knew the constitution of the Holy Roman Emperor. They knew federalism as it was practiced in the Holy Roman Empire. And they knew also that Franklin traveled to Göttingen in order to learn about how federalism works from the Holy Roman Empire. So it was never just a one-directional exchange. So the discussion about political concepts, ideas, experiences always happened in a transnational space that was not just an exchange between two places, but debates about American democracy passed via experience in France, in Germany, in Switzerland, and so on. They were related to that. And you had these incredible periodicals in Italy, like those Cattaneo and Romagnosi and so on were involved with this. And we find sometimes the genre of writing these periodicals may be a bit bizarre from our perspective, but what they mostly did is that they reviewed hundreds and hundreds of books in Spanish, in German, sometimes in Polish, in Baltic languages, and they always found someone who was able to read these languages, and Italians accumulated an absolutely fascinating amount of information from different places within the world. And America played a role in that, but one among many different roles. So this transnational idea that if you really want to understand Italy, we have to approach it in a transnational perspective, and of course other historians of the Risorgimento have done this wonderfully. You see here two examples of scholars who have put a lot of their scholarly energy into trying to explain Italian history from a transnational perspective. But what was important to me is to think also then about a space like Sicily, which had direct engagement with things happening in Britain or in northern Italy. Also, this rethinking a little bit the Habsburg legacy that they related to concepts of political unification. What can they take with them out of this experience and so forth? Another important methodological issue has to do with chronology, and that's something that you both brought up. I think that this division that we have between 18th century historians who know everything about the Enlightenment and 19th century historians, or between Storia Moderna and Storia Contemporanea, or whatever we do, it's a very problematic issue. And I think there has been a very important shift within the historical profession over the last decades, that people understood actually that we cannot any longer understand the age of nationalism or the 19th century or so without thinking very seriously about the legacies of the Age of Enlightenment. And in a way, we always knew this. Also, people, I don't know, when we started being interested in Croce again or so, some decades ago, we knew that one can't understand a figure like Croce without knowing what he understood about Vico or about the Enlightenment and so on. But still, the way how we teach history, the way how we write our manuali, our textbooks and so on, is still very much informed by a traditional, a conventional chronology. And when I wrote this book with this admittedly rather absurd range of dates from 1763 to 1865, this grew very much out of a previous book I wrote, which maybe explains some of that. The origin of this book was actually a collaborative project, Images of America. Images of America in Europe and Latin America. And that was a project that started roughly in 1848 and went all the way to the story of poor Italians traveling to New York and opening a restaurant and becoming rich. Yeah? So this story that we usually have of Italy and America, or Italy and the United States. But when we wrote this book together and we produced a range of articles into collective volume and so on, and it was really a book on the late 19th and early 20th century, I realized that I cannot really understand the significance of what this America they were traveling to was about if I didn't look further back. When I thought I'd produce out of this collaborative project also a monograph, I initially thought I would stick to that chronology. I would somewhere start around 1848 and then write up to, as an opera scholar, for instance, I wanted to finish with something like Franchetti or so, Franchetti's Columbus opera or something like this. But I realized that I cannot understand these debates in 1848 without considering the very important discussion of American political experiments during the Napoleonic period, because people like Botta and so on, they wrote in a direct response also to their experience of the Napoleonic period. And that's how I got further and further back. And for those of you who didn't maybe notice it, 1763 is the end of the 7 Years' War. And for people who know American history, the link between the end of the 7 Years' War and Boston Tea Party and then at some point the American Revolution is quite obvious. What I noticed is an incredible surge of interest in North American political change in Italy from the period of the end of the 7 Years' War, which was for Italy a period of a long peace, where they wrote a lot, and they noticed that suddenly there was this 7 Years' War which had turned into something like a world war. Some military historians call the 7 Years' War the First World War. Not unproblematic, but the Italian response which generated out of that situation was quite remarkable. A strong surge in trying to understand what is happening to the British colonies. It's not an interest necessarily in the American Revolution, but what happens to the colonies of this strong power Britain, a first wave of decolonization. So that really people started, at least scholars started to distinguish between North America and South America, happened around that time. And you're both absolutely right that for many, many people who dared even to write about and publish about the American continent, the distinction between North and South remained obscure for many, many more decades, and we find examples where even in the First World War, the beginning of the First World War, the distinction is not yet clear. And I had lots of sources where they write about La California, which is a neighboring country of Canada, and things like this. A lot of confusion. And this maybe I interject now by responding to that particular question about the American space for that Lucy raised. It is exactly because it remains something relatively amorphous for quite a long time, and even for people writing about it, that I found it important to make that argument. And in a way, this Tiepolo fresco also the idea that this Tiepolo fresco is located in Würzburg, in Germany, but depicting l'America. It's l'America without a distinction between the two. It is for me very significant because there are people who speak about how relevant or not America is for us without that they make this distinction. Yeah? So I think it's part of that story of America and Italy that the distinction for a long time was not clear. At the same time, if you see the back of this is actually one big volume. Here you have these Americans, also interesting, very often in commentary, no distinction between Native Americans and white settlers. What Americans do is that they eat a roast of human flesh, what you see on that side. But the depiction of the Native American woman, you find then a spread of this exact representation of this native woman with her feathers and so on lots of other objects of material culture. No? So you find representations like that, and this was associated with a North American image of a Native American. So the fact that the distinction was not clear, and that actually the lack of a distinction which dates back to the 17th century lives on into the late 18th and early 19th century, was for me one of the raison d'etre of the project. And with regard to chronology, and that's the last point about chronology that I want to make, is that very often our idea what America in Italy might be is informed by what we know about the post-1848 period, roughly, when the United States become in the global economy more important, especially then after the period of Reconstruction and so on, and the mass migration of Italians to North America, which starts, of course, only early in the 20th century. The huge majority of Italian immigrants in my period, they still travel or they migrate within Europe, or they go to Latin America. Very few of them go to North America. But there is this teleological problem that what we think Italy and America is about is so much informed by later developments. And so I wanted to correct that by actually writing a book with a different chronology. The last point that I want to make is about methodology with regard to intellectual history and cultural history, and that's one of the points that Edoardo had also raised. I wanted to attempt to bridge a tradition of intellectual history informed by the Skinnerian Cambridge School approach, where context is defined in a very different way from the way how, for instance, literary scholars or musicologists speak about context. And I try to bridge this with the history of concepts, more Kozelekian approach. And at the same time, I try to bridge intellectual history and cultural history. So Cambridge School version of this book would have concentrated just on texts like I discuss in the first chapter, maybe Botta and Compagnoni and Londonio and some of these people. It is a history that calls itself Ideas in Context or something like that, but actually the context is a purely literary context. For me, it was important to think about what the concepts that are discussed in such works, what they mean in a broader understanding of the social and political language. And for me, the best way to do that is to look at the repercussions of these political debates, either in political life, if I look, for instance, at these parliamentary debates in Sicily in 1848, or in other cultural repercussions like literature, opera, and so on. And what the amazing thing is, Edoardo mentioned this Ballet Bianchi e Neri, which is basically the most important ballo storico, the most important ballet performed in opera theaters in Italy of the entire 19th century, and it's a version of Uncle Tom's Cabin. Yeah? The reviews of those ballets in Italian periodicals, they not only led to debates about slavery and why America needs a slave economy to exist and be strong, but they also led reviews of a ballet, you have to imagine that, led to debates about the advantages and disadvantages of federalism. and of a federal change to the Italian constitutions and so on. So there were highly politicized, political, theoretical debates emerging from these discussions. And of course there is the chapter on Un ballo in maschera, which is maybe obvious because it's an opera set in Boston, but you have exactly the same kind of debates. You see repercussions of debates about political experiments also in other discussions of literature, or in I due Foscari, which is an opera set in Venice, obviously, but you see their repercussions of the political events happening in the reception of these works. You see repercussions of the events in Italy, which are discussed with reference to events across the Atlantic. Yeah? So I think we do a politically more relevant intellectual history if we take account of cultural repercussions. So this is what I wanted to do in the book and what I wanted to somehow summarize for you. Very briefly only on the points that I haven't replied to yet that Lucy and Edoardo raised. I think about the periodization I probably said enough, but about the starting date I said quite a lot. 1865 for me was so important because the fact that this supposedly modern political country across the Atlantic lived on the basis of a slave economy and on what it did to the native population, these were two huge topics in intellectual debates. And even among people who were not hostile, people who admired political institutions in the United States, but they couldn't come to terms with the institution of slavery, which Italian republics and cities had abolished roughly in the Middle Ages already, although some of these cities like Venice and so on, they continued to play a role in the slave trade, but slavery as an institution had been abolished such a long time. So this was a paradigm that they were troubled by. Yeah? And I was myself surprised how incredibly important the American Civil War was in the daily press and how deeply traumatized Italians were by what they knew about the American Civil War. The sheer bloodshed, the brutality of it, gender issues related to it, and so on. And I saw a strong parallel to the way how they discussed the American War of Independence, where again, the conventional story is that Italians admired the American War of Independence, and Botta wrote his book about the American War of Independence because he wanted a similar war of independence for Italy. The opposite is true. It's a strong story in our conventional accounts, but if you look at the Botta's intentions and the contemporary reception, not what the Risorgimento later did out of that book, but what they said at the time, it is very clear that they were deeply shocked by the brutality of the American War of Independence, and they use sometimes exactly the same language again when they discuss the American Civil War. And after the American Civil War, this I know from the other collective volume that we wrote, a lot of the discourse changed because apparently America had resolved the issue of slavery and they became a proper nation, and now we can discuss it differently. So I think 1865 is for Italy a very important date in thinking about the United States. Why I write so much about liberals and Democrats and not more about the conservatives or the Catholics and so on, I think this has partly to do with the way how we in recent years in intellectual history, Italian intellectual history, have started to discuss certain liberals. So there is quite a lot of stuff on Balbo, which shared friends of us discuss as a moderate liberalism. I discuss it as a very, very moderate liberalism that actually looks for the conservative elements in the American Constitution. What Balbo finds interesting about the American Constitution, I make it now a bit too simple perhaps, is the strong institution of a powerful president, of a powerful executive. They use the American model to argue not for democracy, not for republicanism, but America becomes a model for strong monarchy with a strong monarch. So I think actually in that way, we tend now to discuss these as liberals. I see them very much on the conservative side of the liberal spectrum. And the most interesting and the best informed text, which I discuss at quite some length, is Rosmini, who again, Rosmini is now sometimes discussed as almost a liberal, but Rosmini comes, of course, out of a very different context. And I find it interesting that we find much more detailed discussion about American political institutions and the American Constitution by a Catholic and in many respects conservative thinker like Rosmini, he pays more attention to it than our great Romagnosi. No? And I think this is also something that we needed to rebalance a little bit the thing. So this is just about the choice of ideologies with which I engage. Other points Lucy mentioned, I think I reply. Yeah, again, about why did I not look, for instance, for scientists, geographers, geologists, and so on. In a way, we did this in the other book because this interests of geologists traveling. I did quite a lot of work already in the book on Bologna I wrote before, on Giovanni Capellini, rettore dell'Università di Bologna, geologo, creatore del Museo Geologico, Antropologico a Bologna, and so on. He's one of the first who travels there, writes in much detail and so on, and he travels there, if I now remember correctly, just before Italian unification. So it's a slightly different chronology that this scientific interests begin. I have a few other academics who were rather shocked that how little, for instance, the first universities or so had in terms of collections and so on, and then they destroyed it, they burned it all during the Civil War because they even burned the few cultural objects they had during this brutal war. So I think this choice has partly to do with chronology, but some of the aristocratici and so on who traveled and who did botanical and zoological experiments and so on, they carried that knowledge also back, but they still thought at that time it needs Italian and European scientific knowledge to actually make sense of the material that they collected there, Confaloniere and so on. I think the issue on context I addressed at least briefly, so I want to get away from a Skinnerian Cambridge School narrow definition of context, and that's what I try to do. And I also want to get away from a history of political ideas that we teach only to students who specialize in history of political ideas. I think we need to teach political ideas to cultural historians, political historians, social historians, and get this into a broader field. And that's partly how I think about it. And you find then, if you are also trained as a cultural historian, you find incredibly important things about political thought in a review of a ballet or a discussion on the reception of an opera. And I think we need that to make sense of how these political ideas were understood. The historicity of globality, the problem of the inflation of transnational studies and so on. I actually would rather argue that we do far too much transnational studies. It becomes now kind of a shift that we all use, and I'm rather hesitant about it because it sometimes looks almost, if a book is transnational, so it must be a good book without thinking much about the methodology that led to it and so on. I think within transnational studies, the way how ideas flow and that ideas are not passively received but amalgamated into something different. This is exactly what this book is about. Italians learned a lot from the United States, but they didn't need the United States to learn. It's a more complicated relationship because they had an enormous, rich, cosmopolitan cultural baggage in Italy. And American ideas went into that, and then it became a new whole. That's the way how I think about it. And the historicity of globality, yes, I think 1763 is such a moment of a sudden rise of global awareness. There is a reason why suddenly, with the end of the 7 Years' War, these periodicals spread information about America, even if we not yet know exactly where is North America, where is South America, what languages they speak, and so on. But I think it's something that we can still add to the way we study the Enlightenment, how actually an awareness of globality happens also on that level. We have done that for the debates about the noble sauvage and so on, but there are also other factors that play into that and that are maybe closer to what we would call political thought, which can help us to historicize global awareness. And I think this is something that maybe global historians, I don't see myself as a global historian, but maybe that's something that they could also do. So I hope I did justice to your questions. Thank you very much and sorry for speaking far too long.
thank you so much to our three speakers for what was an extraordinarily stimulated. I love the focus on methodology as well, which made the discussion relevant to people who work in very different fields, as well as fascinating about this particular kind of subject area.
When does America become a dreamland in Italy for Italians?
In a way, a dreamland that happens after this book. This was this project where I was engaged with before. It happens very much when actually the United States come then to, they're established politically with the enlargement of the territory, resolving certain constitutional conflicts, resolving the issue of slavery, and then Italians start thinking differently about it, and towards the end of the century, you then start having migration and at some point mass migration towards the United States. But even then, a lot of the reports, and that's fascinating what American historians have done in recent decades about migration, a lot of disappointment remains. And Lucy knows how disappointed Garibaldi was with his North American experience. We think he was a revolutionary and at some point a Republican. He must have loved it. He didn't. Mazzini, the Democrat, he hated every bit about what he knew about America, despite the fact that he was a democratic Republican and so on. So a lot of people who got to know there or went there, Mazzini, of course, himself never went, but he wrote about it, but they remain disappointed. It takes a long time. And only when then really the economic success stories start, it switches. But a lot of the reports that we find in magazines dated after this book, so in the later 19th century, where, for instance, returning migrants write about their experience and how difficult it was for the greenhorns in the United States and that they wanted to go back to their village and so on. It takes a long time. No? It's not easy. I just recently, we did a new Puccini handbook, and there I wrote about the idea of the United States for Italians in the age of Puccini. And there, the associations with the United States is a paradigm of modernity that offers you all opportunities and so on. It's clearly there. So around 1900, it changes dramatically.
But the propaganda starts in Italy for Italians to go, or is it kind of fed across the ocean from the US and it comes back?
I mean, in Italy, really propaganda they don't do because they are, of course, worried about it. They often try to restrict it also. And then Italians who leave in the 1730s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, they go to France. Some of them go to Belgium. And then some go to Latin America, to Argentina and so on. They don't go, it's not really very many. We think because of Da Ponte or so that but it's relatively few people. No? So I have quite a lot of statistics in this book. I'm not a number cruncher usually, but there are quite a lot of statistics to actually illustrate that point, that it starts really relatively late. This book is more about the very few, as Edoardo pointed out, people who traveled there, wrote about it and came back, or people who had some kind of political dealings there.
I have very little to say, just to add. I think the one thing that one learns from migration studies, seems to be one of those true facts, is that propaganda for migration never works. People refuse to go where their rulers or propagandists want them to go, so that's not surprising.
Yeah.
Thanks very much. I look forward to reading the book. It's perhaps beyond the scope of what you wrote, but in your research, did you find any text or documentation of Americans who are here, who were observing the Risorgimento and the early part of the Italian history that you're covering here?
Yeah, I occasionally speak about these people because the interesting thing for me there was, it's of course, this is a book about what Italians thought about America rather than the other way around, but you can't clearly distinguish this. And there are, of course, writers, American writers who come back, meet people there, and some of them are amazed about what they see. Some of it is still of the character of the Grand Tour, a little bit kind of the idea of Italy that you see in these rooms and so on. But other people are also engaging they're interested also in how political institutions evolve in Italy, and also they want to learn from Italian history. So it's a diverse image. But I think what becomes the predominant impression is that Americans come here and think, oh, the Italians have to learn a lot from us. Yeah? And what they did, they probably learned from us. And this becomes a very strong paradigm. Beecher Stowe, of course, comes and is recognized because of the popularity of the novel and the popularity of the ballet. The important thing, I mean, you might think that I'm incredibly elitist, that I make arguments about opera and ballet, but always remember, if Bianchi Neri, the Uncle Tom ballet, is performed at La Scala, you have there more than 3,000 people seeing it. If you have 10 performances, you have 30,000 people engaging with Uncle Tom's Cabin. No book is read in such a short time span by so many people. So that's one of the reasons why I'm interested in theater, because it's actually, in a way, less elite. No? Now there's some more complicated arguments about who sits on the loggione and so on. But so because Uncle Tom's Cabin was so important, Beecher Stowe became important, and she was present, for instance, during the referendum when they, or during the vote in, was it in Tuscany? I wrote it. I can't remember. One of the votes where they decided to become part of Piemonte, the
1959 plebiscite.
Yeah, the plebiscite. She was present in some of these things, and she got altogether a rather negative impression of Italy, and found it, she hated the Catholicism about it, and came up with quite a lot of stereotypes. But there were other people who were more open-minded, and there were, of course, American scholars who come and studied museums and put wonderful collections together, and of course art dealers and so on. So they appear here and there in the book, but they're, of course, not the protagonists of the book, no?
Since he's come up twice and he's so important for the importation of Italian culture to America, I wondered if you wanted to say something more about Da Ponte and what his role was in transmitting an idea of America, particularly the political America, back to Italy.
He wrote about New York. He was, of course, a very colorful figure, and he basically left Europe because of economic and political issues and legal issues and so on. I mean, the story, what I write there about, is not all that originally, because people knew about Da Ponte's experience, because his memoirs had been reissued and so on. But basically, he is disappointed about his experience with Americans in New York. He finds it incredibly difficult to bring Italian and European culture more generally to the American people, and he has this little phrase there that they're always interested in sausages from Bologna and sweets, but not in the wonderful Italian literature that he tries to bring to Italy. But I think he partly sets that up also because it's the kind of genre which probably sells well. It's also funny and so on. So I would read this not so much as a realistic account, but as a literary genre. But it becomes influential then with the Mozart Renaissance in the 19th century, because that's when people start getting interested in Da Ponte. So you know that Mozart didn't continue immediately after 1791 of being widely performed and so on. But when people rediscover Mozart as a new interest in historical music, then this becomes quite an important source. And the original edition is, I think, 4 volumes, if I remember correctly, and the sections on the United States are not the most important ones. So people mostly read this, actually, to get a funny story about his complicated experiences in Europe and in Vienna and so on. But he added then to it this story about the Italian in America who struggles. No?
Hi, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about if you talk in your book about the Latin American Republic experiments and the possible role that they may have played in the Risorgimento. I just couldn't help but think of Simón Bolívar, for example, who gives his very famous sermon in Rome, declaring Spanish American independence. But then obviously you have people like Garibaldi, who spent a considerable amount of time in South America. And you have Italian writers like Carducci, who obviously take great interest in political developments in Latin America. So I was wondering if to what extent the Latin American Republican experiments factor into the possible role that they may have had in this political thought and imagination of the Risorgimento.
A very good point and a very important point, and going back to some of the issues that Lucy had, of course, raised. I think Latin America was very important as an experiment because Italians were there, because they took part in these experiences, and as Maurizio Isabella told us in his wonderful book, Risorgimento in Exile, these ideas traveled back from Latin America into Italy, and again, it was not so much a one direction, it was a multi-directional trying to engage with political experiments, and I think in my story it has a role a bit similar to the role of Switzerland, where very often, I mean, we might think about Switzerland as a small, unimportant country, but for Northern Italians in particular, many of them had been in exile, and so they engaged with it a lot. And concepts, when they discussed the concept of independence, what that means, representation, and then, of course, the general experience, how you stage a revolution, Latin America is there a very, very important element. I wrote maybe a little bit less about that because I wanted to write about North America, so it plays, in a way, a secondary role, but also because we have very good historiography, also a number of French historians who have discussed that, so that this was maybe a field that I didn't want to play out too much in the book, but it's part of this complicated transnational network of ideas where Latin America is obviously very important. But also in a way, of course, people who have worked on Garibaldi and so on recently, they have done quite a lot about the Latin American element. It's partly also an issue of chronology. No?
If I may add something, there is obviously a process of secularization of politics and culture in the 19th century, but still the fact that Latin America and Italy share the common religion plays a really extremely important role.
And what is important there, I had one PhD student who then unfortunately left academia and went into the diplomatic service, but in that context that might be also interesting. And she worked, for instance, about how ideas of Latinity were mediated via France, where they had this periodical La Revue des Races Latines, to have a specialized periodical, something like that, which is exactly about this connection between the French and the Latin American peoples and what role Italy might play in that. So I think it's very important, and the fact that they have shared religion and so on plays a very important role.
I couldn't help but think also of the shared experience of Spanish imperialism, the historical experience of Spanish imperialism, to what extent that might have also...
Now you mentioning that, it reminds me that a certain role plays there that a lot of the commentators try to compare or discuss in comparison British and Spanish colonialism. That plays a role in some of these contexts. And a lot of the books I discuss, they are multi-volume books where you have then one volume, for instance, on North America in the period of the American Revolution. You have another volume that discusses Spanish America and so on.
Hi, thanks. So you constitutional ideas form a big theme in the book. But in a way, it's not surprising, is it, that they didn't find much of interest for them in the American Constitution, because it's about a problem which wasn't theirs, namely the creation of a big, extensive republic from many republican states. I mean, that's also the interesting aspect about Filangieri, who, as you say, was regarded as the Italian Montesquieu, and the whole of the kind of American Constitution debate is about criticizing Montesquieu as much as anything else. So, in a sense, he was such a weird choice for Franklin to believe that his ideas would ever find resonance in the US, though I guess possibly for some of the counter-federalists he might have been of interest. In a way, that's just a sort of point. Although I see the logic of your argument, there's also a certain oddity in people, but maybe that's what you wanted to
Assuming
point
that
out, in
could-
people
yeah,
wanting to imagine that they did get something from the States when their whole kind of problems, series of problems, were rather different, which were the ones, I mean, hence, as you mentioned, the big constitutional model is the Cadiz constitution, which kind of reinforces also the importance of Spanish America for them. But it's because that deals with a set of problems which are so much more theirs than the American constitution.
I mean, this is maybe a point to remind that very often the role that America plays in the debates of this book is that of a negative one, where actually federalism showed to present problems. No? And I mean, I'm someone, when I write about Italy, I always regret that it didn't come to some federal arrangement, and I'm in some of my writing quite critical of the role played by Piemonte and centralizzazione and so on. But in a way, America played there an unfortunate role, because after the experience of the American Civil War, it became even more difficult to think about federalization or local autonomy and so on. No? So we would assume that Democrats and so on, they look at the United States and get something positive from there, or would admire it. And of course, one of my colleagues, he worked on images of the United States in Britain, and there you had a very progressive, a pool of progressive thinkers who took a lot of positive things from Britain, because they thought they can discuss the United States to democratize British politics. But for Italy, very often it played a rather negative role, because they were very deeply traumatized by how wrong many things also went. But in a way, I had to write this book to find that out and to assess it, and to assess the relative role, where we all assume it plays a big and important role. And I remember discussions that we had in our project group with other academics and PhD students and so on, where I really had a hard time fighting my corner to say, no, the United States were not all that important. They were important, but they played a different role. No? So in a way, I had to write the book also to say that.
I think maybe with one eye on the clock, I should call a kind of end to this discussion, but fortunately we do have a reception crew in the office outside, as we call it. It's a rather more scenic room than the office. Right, so we can continue this discussion over a glass of Prosecco. So first, though, I'd like just to thank our speakers once again for just a really, truly fascinating discussion.